right, welcome again. We are down to the book of Hebrews and James in our series called 66 Books in 52 Weeks as we make our way book through book, book by book, through the greatest book ever written, that is the Bible. So let's look here at the book of Hebrews. We'll just jump right in there. And on the outline, you can see just a little summary here, the book of Hebrews here. It's the 19th book in the New Testament. It's got 13 chapters. It's just a general epistle or letter, and we'll talk about who wrote it and some of those things in just a little bit here. An outline here. This outline puts it this way. Hebrews 1 through 7, Christ is superior. Hebrews 8 through 10, Christ is the priest of the new covenant. Hebrews 11 through 13, faith, hope, and love. And so that's one outline there. We're going to approach it a little bit of a different way here. Here is the key verse here. It's really the first two verses of the book here, Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom also he made the universe. That right there really is the message of Hebrews in a nutshell. In a lot of ways, I look at the book of Hebrews as just the perfect transition between the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's showing how the Old Testament and the New Testament relate to each other and how things in the time of Christ are greater than they were in the times of the Old Testament. So let's look a little bit of background on this book. The authorship. Who wrote the book of Hebrews? Well, it's not quite known. It's not confirmed, but there are a lot of scholars who believe that there is evidence to attribute this book to be written by the Apostle Paul. So here are some reasons that some scholars say it's probably Paul that wrote this. Could very well be. First of all, the writer seemed familiar with suffering in prison. Paul knew about that. And then also, he wrote from Italy and spoke of Timothy. So it seems like he's a guy running in the same circles as Paul. Very well could be him. Hebrews 13:23. I want you to know that our brother Timothy has been released, and if he arrives soon, I will come with him to see you. Sounds like Paul talking, although we can't outright confirm it here. Peter possibly identifies Paul as the writer. In 2 Peter 3:15 through 16, Peter writes, "Bear in mind that our Lord's patience means salvation, just as our dear brother Paul also wrote to you with the wisdom that God gave him. He writes the same way. He writes the same way in all his letters, speaking in them of these matters. His letters contain some things that are hard to understand, which ignorant and unstable people distort, as they do the other scriptures, to their own destruction." Some people think that when Peter wrote this, that he was referring to the book of Hebrews. So that's some of the reasons that they point to the book of Hebrews as possibly being written by Paul, but we don't know. It's just not confirmed exactly who wrote it. When was this written? We know that it was written sometime before AD 70. So why would we say that it would be before AD 70? Well, Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 1 speaks as if sacrifices are ongoing in the temple in Jerusalem. And so this would place the writing before AD 70, because in AD 70, that's when the Romans came in and destroyed Jerusalem, and they stopped the sacrifices there. So we know that it was sometime before AD 70. So who was this book written for? Well, the original audience was written to Hebrew Christians who may have been considering a return to Judaism. Thus the theme of the book here. Perhaps because of immaturity stemming from a lack of understanding of biblical truths. It was also written for believers everywhere. So what is the purpose of this book? The purpose was to encourage Jewish Christians undergoing fierce persecution not to abandon their faith. The people needed to be reassured that Christianity was true and that Jesus was indeed the Messiah, and that it was okay to just continue pursuing their faith in this way. And so if you're looking to fill something in here, what is the theme on your outline there? The theme is this: Christ is greater. I think we did a sermon series a while back called Greater, based on the book of Hebrews, and Christ is greater. And so let's just move on here to the outline here of the book of Hebrews here. There's two sections. There's a doctrinal section and a practical section. That also kind of points to maybe it could be the Apostle Paul, because a lot of times his letters would start off with all these doctrinal teachings, and then he'd say, therefore, and all the therefores is this is how you should live because of all these doctrinal biblical teachings here. So let's start with the doctrinal section here, chapters 1 through 10. The theme is Christ is greater than the old covenant. So we use the term Old Testament, New Testament. That is interchangeable with Old Covenant, New Covenant. So it's the same thing when we say this. So the Old Covenant represents the old way that God related to his people. The New Covenant represents the way God relates to us in the era of Christ. So here's what the writer points out here. Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. Christ is greater than the prophets of the old covenant. So we read those first verses there. In the past, God spoke through our ancestors through prophets at many times and in various ways, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom also he made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty in heaven. So, first of all, Christ is greater than the prophets, and so the writer of Hebrews very vividly explains how Christ is greater. He goes on then to explain that Christ is greater than the angels. That's Hebrews 1:4 through 2:18. And so in this section here, he points out he's greater than the angels because he is God. So he talks about the deity of Christ. One little verse here from verse 5 in there says, "You are my son." For which of the angels did God ever say, "You are my son, today I have become your father"? So he's pointing out, okay, Christ is greater than the angels. They're in a different category than Jesus. And then the writer goes on to talk a little bit about the humanity of Jesus. In Hebrews chapter 2, verse 17 and 18. Paul says, "For this reason he had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. Because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted." And so we're seeing here that Christ is greater than the angels. Really, we see here again, fully God, fully man at the same time. Now, do I understand that completely? No. There's a mystery behind this. But he is fully God and fully man. Christ is greater than the angels. So you can see kind of the theme here in Hebrews. Christ is greater than all these things. Then the writer goes on to say, Christ is greater than Moses. So this would have been a big deal to the Jewish people back in that day. If you got up and said Christ is greater than Moses, that would have been almost like blasphemy. Those are, as I would have heard growing up in Virginia, them were fighting words that you would have heard back in that day. So chapter 3, verses 1 through 3 says, "Therefore, holy brothers and sisters, who share in the heavenly calling, fix your thoughts on Jesus, whom we acknowledge as our apostle and high priest. He was faithful to the one who appointed him, just as Moses was faithful in all God's house. Jesus has been found worthy of greater honor than Moses. Revolutionary to say something like that. Just as the builder of a house has greater honor than the house itself. So Jesus is the author of the law and all things that were connected with Moses. And so then, if that's not good enough there, then we move on here and we see that Christ is greater than Joshua. Hebrews chapter 4, 3 through 13 there. So look at verse 8 of Hebrews chapter 4. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day. So you might remember when we went through the Old Testament, I kept saying, every time we study this here in the Old Testament, it's looking forward to something greater. Well, that's really the theme of the book of Hebrews, pointing out all these things in the Old Testament. Really, this was pointing forward to something greater. Joshua was known for bringing the Israelites into the promised land. You know, they'd wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. They made it into the promised land, or the land of rest. Jesus gives us a greater promised land, or a greater land of rest. So Christ is greater than Joshua. Now this brings us on. We'll move on to the next part here. Christ is greater than the Old Testament priesthood. So you might remember we studied in Leviticus all the stuff about the priest, how that was all set up. The author of Hebrews is telling us Jesus is greater than all of that. So he begins to talk about our great high priest. If you look at Hebrews 4, beginning in verse 14, this is one of those key verses. You could almost have this as the key verse of Hebrews. But therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weakness, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. You know, a few weeks ago, I got to go to a concert. And if you've ever been to like a larger concert, usually they have opening acts. And you want to be supportive of the opening acts, and they did a good job, and you're thinking, well, it's kind of exciting to watch this music and enjoy it. And first opening act came on, the second opening act came on, and then it came time for the main event. Well, suddenly when the main event came on, all of a sudden the volume was louder, the lights were brighter, the crowd was more energetic. Jesus is the main event. So the prophets, all that stuff was all just the opening act. And yeah, there was a lot of impressive stuff. You know, Elijah and Elisha, that's pretty impressive. Moses parting the Red Sea, or God parting the Red Sea through Moses, pretty impressive. Wasn't the main act. The main act is Jesus. So then the writer here, sometimes I might accidentally say Paul, but I'm just going to say the writer of Hebrews here gives a description of the earthly priest. So look here in verses 1 through 5 of chapter 5. Every high priest is selected from among the people and is appointed to represent the people in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. This is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as for the sins of the people. So there's a contrast being made here. Earthly priest, Old Testament, had sin. Jesus had no sin. Earthly priests were selected from the people. Jesus was selected from heaven. And so you see this, Jesus is greater than the priesthood. Then there is just a general call to maturity in Hebrews chapter 6, beginning in verse 1. Therefore let us move beyond the elementary teachings about Christ and be taken forward to maternity, not laying again the foundation of repentance from acts that lead to death and faith in God instructions about cleansing rites, the laying of hands, the resurrection of the dead, and eternal judgment, and God permitting, we will do so. And so what this writer is saying is, if you want to be mature, understanding the superiority of Christ is what will lead to your maturity. Okay, moving on here. I need to make sure I'm working on time here. So we have this interesting passage here about Christ and a man by the name of Melchizedek. That's in Hebrews 7. Here the writer uses an example of a mysterious person first mentioned in Genesis 14 during the life of Abraham. So you're going way, way back in history. So Abraham had just rescued his nephew Lot from some captivity. After a battle, Abraham met with a mysterious priest named Melchizedek. He just kind of shows up in the passage here. There's no explanation, what he's about, but he blesses Abraham, and Abraham gives him a tithe or a tenth of everything. And this was before the time of Moses. So the writer here is using this analogy here. So what are we learning from this here? So this mysterious person that just seemed to appear, although we know that wasn't the real case, but just for the sake of reading it, all of a sudden in the book of Genesis, this guy just shows up, So the writer takes advantage of this. And so the point he's making is that Jesus is our perpetual priest, I should say. He is our peace as well, but he is our perpetual priest. And so talking about this Melchizedek, all right? So he just shows up in the Bible in verse 3, Hebrews 7:3, without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning or days or end of life, resembling the Son of God, he remains priest forever. So, and again, using this picture of, just like Melchizedek, he might as well just be forever because we don't know about his genealogy or anything. He's just using that as a symbol. And then Christ is also described as the perfect priest. So if you look at verse 27 of Hebrews 7, unlike other high priests, he does not need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins, then for the sins of the people. He sacrificed for their sins once for all when he offered himself. Can you see this picture? What we're living in now is greater than what they had in the Old Testament. So it's just comparing those two things. So, repeating again here, Christ is our high priest, ministers in a superior sanctuary by a better covenant, built upon better promises. So, in the Old Testament, you had a tabernacle or a temple, and it's said to be that was kind of a little bit of a picture of heaven, just a little bit to kind of represent that. But now, they had the Old Testament, the Old Covenant tabernacle, but now Jesus is in the true tabernacle. We had the Old Covenant, now we have a better covenant. We had the old sanctuary, now there is a better sanctuary. We had the countless sacrifices over and over and over again, these animals that could not take away sins. Now we have the superior once and for all sacrifice. And then the writer here just ends up by giving some encouragement. So you can see here what we have now is better than what we had then. So that brings us, that's the doctrinal section. That brings us to a practical section here. So Christ brings better benefits and duties and just a better life than what was had, that could be had in the Old Testament. So first of all, the writer moves on to Hebrews chapter 11, and we call this chapter the Faith Hall of Fame. So through that, you see all of these people who walked by faith, and as you look at them walking by faith, we're encouraged that we walk by faith even today. And at the beginning of Hebrews chapter 12, after listing all of these people who walked by faith and who lived their life by faith, we have this hope. It says that, therefore, in Hebrews 12, the first couple of chapters there, that first couple of verses in Hebrews 12, It says, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, in other words, look at this crowd of people who came before us and lived by faith. If they did it, you can do it too. And so he's trying to give encouragement to these people who underwent all kinds of persecutions and hard times under the old covenant. He said, if they could do that under the old covenant, just think what you can endure during the new covenant. And so he talks about living as a Christian, running the Christian race, and then enduring hardship because we can look back to the people who've lived by faith before. So then this brings us to chapter 13, and I'm making sure we're going to get through James tonight too. So here are the concluding remarks in chapter 13. He talks generally about some subjects such as hospitality, marriage, and then leaders. The hospitality, that's where you get that passage where to be kind to strangers, you never know if you're entertaining angels unaware. In this passage, this is one I quote a lot of times in marriage ceremonies, that marriage is to be honored among all people, and then also that our leaders are to be honored and prayed for. And then the writer here goes on to admonish them to stay steady in their doctrine and their teachings, and finally to let your actions match your belief. So this is an encouraging letter to say, look, stay the course. What you've got now is better than what you had then. Stay the course. And then there's just some closing words, like a lot of the letters. And if you're thinking that maybe Paul wrote this, a lot of times Paul would close out his letters with shout-outs and closing remarks and those types of things. So let's move on here to the book of James. So we've all got that down, right? And all memorized, right? Okay, very good. So let's move on to the book of James here. We'll look at the overview here. And I'll zoom in here for you people that are watching the video here. It's the 20th book in the New Testament. It's got 5 chapters to it. We'll move on to the other summary here. Here's one way it's been outlined here. James 1, handling trials. James 2, favoritism, faith, and deeds. James 3, the problem with the tongue, the bitter envy and selfish ambition. James 4, humility and submitting to God's will. And James 5, warning to the rich, patience and suffering in the prayer of faith. Key verse in the book of James: do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. I think even earlier tonight, part of my prayer, sometimes I'll pray that as we study, that we not just be hearers of the word, but that we be doers as well. That it basically comes from that passage there in James chapter 1. So let's move on to some of the background of James. So, James, the author, this is the brother of Jesus. So there are several people named James in the Bible. Now we have a lot of Daves around here. Dave Mason, Dave Lynn, Dave Klontz. There's a lot of Dave Wetzel. There's a lot of Daves around here. Well, there was a lot of Jameses in the Bible here. So you had James, the son of Zebedee, James and the brother of John, James the son of Alphaeus, James the father of Judas the disciple, and then you have James, the brother of our Lord, which would be the one who wrote this book, is what we believe. Initially, you might remember, during the ministry, during the life of Jesus on earth, his brother James did not believe in Jesus, but later on, Paul referred to this James as a pillar of the church. Now, in James's defense for not believing Jesus right away, if your sibling all of a sudden came along and said, hey, I'm the Messiah, would you believe them right away? It might take a little convincing. So there we go. So here's an interesting fact here. I think this is from Warren Wiersbe. Tradition says that he prayed so much that his knees were as hard as camels. That's an old tradition, historic tradition. So I find that kind of interesting. This book was written around AD 45 to 50, likely the first book of the New Testament to be written, as far as chronologically in order when it was written. The audience, this book was written, if you look at the first verses there, quote unquote, to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations. So the primary audience was to Christian Jews, and the theme is spiritual maturity. We did a series on this book several years back called Grow Up. You might remember we had these big block letters on the stage that said Grow Up, and it was just basically on the book of James. And so there were several areas where the Christians that were being written to by James, they needed to grow up here. So let's take a look at an outline here of the book, of this little book here, and the things we can learn from it. First of all, chapters 1 through 3 gives us a picture of genuine faith, I should say, genuine faith. First thing we learn about genuine faith is that trials can help us grow our faith. Trials can help us develop patience. Let me read to you verse 2 through 4. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. And enduring trials builds ultimate blessing. Verse 12, blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised those who love him. So trials can help grow our faith, and sometimes I'll jokingly say that every now and then I'll just pray this prayer, Lord, please don't build my character today. But that's not really a good prayer to pray. But because when we go through trials, it builds our faith and it builds our character. So another point that James makes here in verse 13, that God does not test our faith with evil. He never tempts us to do wrong. In verse 13, when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. Temptations do not come from God. Where does evil come from, or what does temptation come from? We just need to look at the mirror here. Evil comes from within. Verse 14 and 15, but each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. And so when we're going through a trial, we understand we can grow through it. When we are tempted, we need to understand that is not coming from God. Ultimately, the temptation comes from within ourselves because it has to do with our own desires here. Faith is verified by putting God's word into practice. Verse 23 and 24, anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in a mirror and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. So faith is verified by putting God's word into practice. And then faith is verified by the way we view and treat other people. There's a passage here that just talks about not showing favoritism. So a person that is truly living by faith in Christ, they're going to treat other people in a good way. Faith is ultimately verified by our actions. So we don't do good things to be saved. We do good things because we are saved. And but sometimes the things that we do, good actions here, they verify our faith. This in verse 18 of James 2. But someone will say, you have faith and I have deeds. Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by my deeds, by what I do. And also finally here in chapter 3, whole chapter here, faith is verified by the words we choose. And James really hits this hard. If you can control your mouth, if you can control your words, you have a lot of control over yourself there. So that's a huge thing. Faith is verified by the words that we choose. So now James goes on to talk about having the right mindset in our lives and about mindset about different things. So he talks about having the right mindset towards unity in chapter 4, verse 1, he covers the idea of what is it that causes fights and quarrels. Those things come from the desires that battle within you. And so if there's fights and quarrels going on, you need to kind of check yourself, have the right mindset. Then there's the right mindset towards the world. By the world, what that means is anything that is opposed to God. That is, and so James says friendship with the world means enmity towards God, and that's in chapter 4 and verse 4. So as you grow, your faith is growing, you're going to have also the right mindset towards time. This is a passage that I've read quite often, and sometimes I go back and read it again just as a reminder. It is amazing how quickly time goes by. You probably heard the old saying, the older I get, it seems like the days get longer, but the years go shorter. Feel shorter. The days go slowly, but the years go by quickly. And it's amazing how you blink your eyes and 20 years has gone by. You blink your eyes again, another 20 years has gone by. And so this is what James says in James 4:14. Why you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You're a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. And so we live our lives, and even, if let's just say we set the world record and we live to be 140 years old or something like that, or however old somebody might be, the oldest person in the world, when you close your eyes on this earth, the time on this earth is like a mist that appears and is gone in comparison to eternity. A person that's growing and maturing is going to have the right mindset towards greed and money. So the writer here, James, goes on to just talk about greed and those that sought money just for the sake of greed. He says in chapter 5 and verse 5, you have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. Well, there's some pretty descriptive words there for that. But that's just having that mindset of always wanting more. You will never be satisfied. So then a growing person, a mature person, is going to have the right mindset towards suffering. Chapter 5 and verse 7. Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. And here's the idea. Be patient until the Lord's coming. That's the key phrase right there. You have to view suffering in light of the ultimate return of Jesus Christ. I was listening to a sermon by Tony Evans today, this morning, and he was talking about the idea of the sufferings and the trials that we go through here, and then the reward that we might face, that we will look forward to down the road. And sometimes it's easy to give up, but he used this example. He says, what if you hated to eat squash? Now, you hated that food, but if you were told that if you had to eat squash once a day for a whole year, and if you ate squash once a day for a whole year, then all of your bills would be taken care of for the rest of your life. Would you have a different view of squash after that? I might eat 2 of them every day if I knew that. And so that's the same way. When we have the right mindset, when we view things in light of eternity and light of heaven, we have a different view on the things that we consider to be suffering. So, and view things in light of the second coming. And then, finally, the right mindset towards prayer. Now, this is an interesting passage here, chapter 5, verse 17 through 18. James gives instructions on praying for the sick. This is where the instruction is given to bring some elders together and anoint somebody with oil and pray with them. And, I've been a part of some of those prayers through the years. And that is some of the most meaningful times of prayer that you can have. And then also, James says sometimes we think that prayer is just for the super spiritual, or just for people we read about in the Bible, just for people that it's not something that's attainable for me, that real significant prayer. But notice what James says here in James 5:17 and 18. Elijah was a human being, even as we are. In modern terms, he said he put his pants on one leg at a time. We use that phrase. He was just like you and me. He prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the land 3.5 years. Again he prayed, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth produced its crops. Again, what he's saying is, these people didn't have a corner on prayer. They prayed. You can pray too. There's no reason you shouldn't do that. So we have gotten through. I can't believe how quickly we were able to get through those 2 books there, the overview of those. But we do have a few applications here we can make here. And the lessons is this. First of all, Christians have things better than people of the Old Testament. I don't know about you, but there are some times, even though we do live in the New Testament, there are some times where I thought, there were some pretty cool things that happened in the Old Testament. I really would have liked to have seen the parting of the Red Sea. I would have liked to have seen that axe head floating, or I would have liked to have seen. I tell you, the one was Elisha. You might remember Elisha, and he was walking down the street, and these youth came along and said, "Go on, you bald head! Go on, you bald head!" and mocked the bald prophet. And then some bears came out of the woods and mauled those kids. And I thought, man, that's a great story. Wait a minute, I don't know. I would like to. Okay, I got sidetracked there. In all seriousness, I've always wondered, I always thought that was a strange story there. But even though you see all of these amazing things, the sun standing still. What was that like? And just think about these amazing, amazing miracles. We have it better. We have it better. It would have been pretty cool to see a fire over top of you by night and a cloud guiding you by day. Or to see Moses going up on the mountain, because he knows at the top of that mountain he is talking to God, and he's coming down with these tablets with God's actual handwriting. The finger of God wrote these commandments on these tablets. That would have been pretty cool to see. We have it better than they did in the Old Testament because of Christ. Because of Christ. We kind of look at those Old Testament things and think, those we kind of need to see. They could only dream of what we know today and experience through Christ. Christians have things better than people of the Old Testament. And the second thing here, this is from the book of James. True faith is a growing faith. So I've heard people that treat faith as just some kind of an intellectual exercise. But it's really much more than that. It's not just accepting a certain amount of knowledge or thing. Faith is it's a growing faith. It's not just about the amount of knowledge that you take in. It's about the amount of obedience that is exhibited in your life. That is called the fruit of faith. So that covers the book of Hebrews and the book of James, and we'll continue next week with the rest of our study here.